Emily's life in the grand mansion was one of isolation, despite its outward appearance of wealth and luxury. The towering walls and pristine furnishings did little to mask the emptiness that filled every corner of her existence. From the outside, it was easy to assume that Emily had everything she could ever want, but the truth was far different. The halls of the mansion were silent, save for the occasional echo of her footsteps, a stark reminder of how alone she truly was. The days were long and monotonous, each one blending into the next with the same dull routine. Emily spent most of her time in her room, a spacious yet cold space that lacked any real comfort. She had no friends to speak of, no one to share her thoughts or feelings with. The few times she ventured into the outside world, she did so alone, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was different from the other girls her age, different in a way that made her feel disconnected from everyone around her. The loneliness she felt was made all the more painful by the absence of her father, the one person who had truly loved her. He had been the center of her world, a beacon of warmth and kindness in a life that was otherwise filled with shadows. Emily often found herself lost in memories of him. His laughter, the way he would swing her around in the air, the sound of his voice as he read her bedtime stories. But those memories were all she had left. Her father had died in a car accident years ago, leaving a void in her heart that nothing could fill. In the months following his death, Emily's mother, Margaret, had changed. The grief had hardened her, turning her into a woman driven by ambition and a relentless pursuit of power. Margaret threw herself into her work, climbing the corporate ladder with a cold determination that left little room for anything or anyone else. Emily became an afterthought, a silent observer of her mother's transformation. It wasn't long before Margaret introduced a new man into their lives. His name was Richard, and Margaret presented him to Emily as her new stepfather. There was no discussion, no consideration of Emily's feelings. Richard was simply there one day, occupying the space that had once belonged to her father. He was distant, indifferent, and Emily quickly realized that he had no interest in being a father to her. The mansion that had once been her home now felt more like a gilded cage. The love and warmth that had once filled its rooms were gone, replaced by a coldness that seeped into Emily's very soul. She was alone in a house that no longer felt like hers, surrounded by people who were supposed to be her family, but felt like strangers. And in the quiet moments, when the loneliness became too much to bear, she would close her eyes and remember her father, wishing with all her heart that he was still there to hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay. The grand mansion stood tall under the grey sky, its pristine white walls reflecting the wealth and success that Margaret had meticulously built. Inside, however, the air was cold, devoid of warmth or affection. Emily sat in her room, a modest cake in front of her, its single flickering candle casting a dim light. Today was her 18th birthday, a milestone she had hoped would bring a moment of connection with her mother, Margaret, and her stepfather, Richard. But the house was silent, save for the occasional distant laughter coming from Margaret's study. Gathering her courage, Emily descended the grand staircase. The polished marble floors echoed her hesitant steps as she approached the study. She hesitated outside the door, her hand trembling as she knocked. "Come in." Margaret's voice was sharp, laced with impatience. Emily opened the door, peeking inside. Margaret sat behind her massive desk, surrounded by papers and her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Richard lounged in a corner, engrossed in a conversation on his phone. "Mum, I was hoping we could—" Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily," Margaret interrupted, not looking up from her work. "I'm busy. What is it?" Emily's heart sank, but she pressed on, her voice trembling. "It's my birthday today. I thought maybe we could spend some time together. Just us. Maybe go to the park or have dinner." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes cold and calculating. "Emily, you're not a child anymore. I have important things to handle. You need to stop being so selfish with your demands." Richard glanced up, raising an eyebrow, but saying nothing. The indifference in his gaze stung as much as Margaret's words. I just wanted to feel like a family," Emily whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Margaret's face twisted in frustration. "Enough, Emily. I've given you everything, this house, your education, a life of comfort. And yet, you keep asking for more. You need to understand that the world doesn't revolve around your desires. Grow up." The sharpness of Margaret's words cut through Emily like a knife. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a wave of panic swept over her. "Mum, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "If you're so unhappy here, maybe it's time you leave. I'm tired of your constant neediness. You're 18 now. It's time you learn to fend for yourself." Emily stared at her mother in disbelief, her world crumbling around her. You're kicking me out?" "Yes," Margaret snapped, her voice like ice. "Pack your things and go. I won't have you disrupting my life any longer." Richard looked away, his silence confirming the finality of Margaret's decision. Emily's legs felt weak as she stumbled back, her mind racing. How had it come to this? How had she become so disposable? Tears blurred her vision as she turned and fled the study, her heart breaking with each step. She ran up to her room, the once cozy space now feeling like a prison. Her hands shook as she grabbed a few clothes and stuffed them into a bag. She paused only to take a small framed photo of her and her father, a man who had once made her feel loved and cherished, a man whose absence left a gaping hole in her life. With her bag slung over her shoulder, Emily descended the staircase one last time. She cast a final glance at the cold, empty mansion that had never felt like home. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the hollow space that had once been her life. Outside, the world seemed larger, colder. Emily stood on the front steps, the weight of her mother's rejection heavy on her shoulders. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The wind whipped around her, chilling her to the bone as she took her first steps into the unknown, each one carrying her further away from the life she had known, and deeper into the abyss of fear and uncertainty. The streets of New York had never felt so unforgiving. Emily wandered aimlessly, her footsteps heavy, her vision blurred by exhaustion and tears. The city that once felt vibrant and alive now loomed over her, a vast, uncaring jungle of concrete and steel. Every building, every street corner seemed to mock her solitude. It had only been a few hours since she'd left the mansion. No, since she'd been cast out, discarded like something unwanted. The weight of rejection pressed down on her shoulders, making each step harder than the last. She hugged herself against the cold, her thin jacket offering little protection against the biting wind. As the afternoon faded into evening, the streets became busier, filled with people rushing home, oblivious to the girl stumbling through the crowd. Emily felt as though she was fading into the background, becoming just another face among thousands. But unlike the others, she had no destination, no warm home waiting for her. She tried to find refuge in the places she once knew, cafes she used to visit with her father, the park where he used to take her on weekends. But each spot was filled with memories too painful to bear, and she found herself moving on, deeper into the city, into unfamiliar territory. Her energy waned as the hours dragged on. Her legs ached, her stomach growled, and her head throbbed with the beginnings of a migraine. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and the thought of food was a distant dream. All she wanted now was to sit down, to rest, to disappear from the world for a little while. But there was nowhere to go. She approached a bench in a small park, but it was already occupied by someone who eyed her suspiciously as she neared. She turned away, feeling the sting of rejection once more, and kept walking. Night was falling, and with it came a deepening sense of dread. The city that was once bustling now grew darker, more threatening. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the cold seemed to seep into her bones. Emily's steps became unsteady, her vision narrowing as fatigue took hold. She didn't even notice when her legs gave out beneath her. One moment she was walking, the next she was on the ground, her knees scraping against the rough pavement. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled, and she collapsed back down, too tired to care. It was then that she felt a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. She flinched, expecting the worst, but when she looked up, she saw a pair of kind eyes gazing down at her. "Easy there," the man said, his voice rough but filled with concern. "You look like you've had a rough day." Emily couldn't find the words to respond. She just stared at him, her body too drained to move. The man, Samuel, knelt down beside her, his weathered face softening with empathy. "Come on, let's get you off this cold ground," he said, offering her his hand. "I've got a place not too far from here where you can rest." With no strength left to resist, Emily took his hand. Samuel helped her to her feet, his grip steady and reassuring. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, guiding her down the street at a slow, careful pace. As they walked, Samuel didn't ask any questions, and Emily was grateful for the silence. It wasn't long before they reached a small, run-down shelter tucked away in an alley. It wasn't much, a few blankets, a makeshift bed, but to Emily, it felt like a sanctuary. Samuel eased her onto the bed and handed her a piece of bread from his pack. "Eat," he said simply. "You need your strength." Emily took the bread with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. She hadn't expected kindness, not after the day she'd had. But here it was, offered by a stranger who had nothing to gain from helping her. As she nibbled on the bread, Samuel settled in beside her, making sure she was comfortable. For the first time since leaving the mansion, Emily felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The night had settled into a quiet stillness, the kind that blankets the city when most of its inhabitants are tucked away in their warm beds. But for Emily and Samuel, the streets of Brooklyn were the only refuge. They found a small alcove between two old brick buildings, just wide enough to shield them from the wind. Samuel spread out a threadbare blanket on the cold pavement and motioned for Emily to sit. As she eased down onto the blanket, Emily let out a long, weary breath. The exhaustion of the past few days weighed heavily on her, but there was a strange sense of comfort in this makeshift shelter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, and for now, she wasn't alone. Samuel settled in beside her, leaning back against the wall. "You holding up okay?" he asked, his voice rough but gentle. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. "I'll manage," she replied quietly, pulling her jacket tighter around her. I didn't expect things to turn out like this." Samuel looked at her, his gaze filled with a kind of understanding that comes from experience. "Life's full of surprises," he said, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "One minute, you think you've got everything figured out, and the next, It all comes crashing down." Emily glanced over at him, sensing there was more to his words. "You too?" she asked softly. He nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "Yeah. I had a life once. Good job, a nice apartment, friends. Then one day my best friend tells me he's got this great investment opportunity. Says it's a sure thing, something we could both retire on. I trusted him. Put everything I had into it." He paused, the weight of the memory heavy in the air. Turns out it was all a scam. He took the money and ran, left me with nothing but a pile of debts and an eviction notice. That's how I ended up out here. Emily listened, her heart aching for him. She'd thought her situation was bad, but Samuel's story was a stark reminder that everyone had their own burdens to bear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not knowing what else to say. He shrugged, though there was no hiding the pain in his expression. "It is what it is. Can't change the past. You just have to keep moving forward, even when it feels like there's no way out." For a while, they sat in silence, the sounds of the city distant and muted. Emily's mind drifted back to her own life, to the mansion she once called home, to the coldness of her mother's rejection. She'd been so desperate for love, for acceptance, and instead she'd been thrown out like yesterday's trash. "It's my 18th birthday," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Or, well, it was. I thought maybe things would be different, that my mum might actually care, just this once." Samuel looked at her, his eyes softening with sympathy. "Did she?" Emily shook her head, her throat tightening with the memory. "No, she told me she was too busy. My stepdad didn't even look up from his magazine. They didn't care. So I left." Samuel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's tough, kid, real tough. But you know what? You're stronger than you think. Takes guts to walk away from something like that, even if it hurts like hell." Emily swallowed hard, the sting of his words hitting close to home. "I didn't feel strong. I still don't." "Strength isn't always about feeling like you can take on the world," Samuel said, his voice firm but kind. "Sometimes it's just about getting through the day, putting one foot in front of the other, even when you're scared out of your mind." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have anywhere to go." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke with a quiet resolve. "You've got something, though. I heard you humming earlier when we were walking. You've got a voice, Emily. A good one." Emily blinked, surprised. "It's just something I do when I'm nervous. I've never sung in front of anyone before." "Well, maybe it's time to start," Samuel suggested. "People around here, they're always looking for something real, something that touches them. You could be that something." She hesitated, the idea both terrifying and strangely appealing. "You really think so?" "I do," Samuel said firmly. "It's not going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. You've got a chance to take control of your life, to make something of it. And I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." Emily nodded slowly, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't completely lost. Maybe, just maybe, she could find her way again. And with Samuel by her side, she knew she wouldn't have to do it alone. The days had grown longer, each one bleeding into the next with the same monotony of struggle. Emily and Samuel had fallen into a rhythm, moving through the streets of Brooklyn as they sought out what little comfort they could find. The chill of early morning air bit at their skin as they huddled together in an alleyway, sharing the last of a stale loaf of bread. Samuel looked at Emily as she stared at the broken pieces in her hand, clearly trying to make them last. The hunger was a constant companion now, gnawing at them both, but Emily never complained. She was stronger than she looked, Samuel thought, even if she didn't realize it herself. As they sat in silence, Samuel closed his eyes, trying to find some sense of peace. But then something caught his attention. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable as it grew. It was Emily, humming quietly to herself, a tune filled with melancholy and longing. He opened his eyes and watched her, the way her lips moved, the way the music seemed to pour out of her effortlessly, as if it was a part of her soul. In that moment, the bleakness of their surroundings seemed to fade, replaced by the raw beauty of her voice. "Emily," Samuel said gently, not wanting to startle her. She stopped humming abruptly, her cheeks flushing as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry," she murmured, looking away. "No, don't be sorry," he replied, leaning closer. "You've got a gift, you know that." Emily shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just something I do, to pass the time." Samuel shook his head. "It's more than that. You've got a voice that can move people. I can feel it, right here," he said, placing a hand over his heart, "and I bet others would feel it too if they heard you." Emily glanced up at him, uncertainty clouding her eyes. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. I think you should sing out there where people can hear you. Maybe at the square, where the crowds are. Who knows? You might make a little money." She hesitated, the idea clearly terrifying. "I've never sung in front of people before, Samuel. What if they don't like it?" Samuel smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "In this world we don't have much to lose, but you've got something special, Emily. Something that can give people a reason to stop, to listen, to feel. And maybe, just maybe, it'll bring us some much-needed help." Emily chewed on her lip, the fear and doubt warring with the flicker of hope that Samuel's words had ignited. She looked around at their meager surroundings, the cold pavement, the crumbling walls, the emptiness of their lives. What did she have to lose? "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll try." Samuel reached out and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll go together," he said, "and no matter what happens, you'll know you tried. That's all that matters." As they stood up to leave the alley, the first rays of morning light began to break through the clouds. The city was waking up, and so too, it seemed, was a new sense of determination in Emily. With Samuel by her side, she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The streets were alive with the usual chaos, honking horns, the hum of conversation, the clatter of footsteps on the pavement. Emily stood at the edge of a busy intersection, her heart pounding in her chest. The noise and bustle of the city seemed to close in on her, making her feel smaller and more insignificant with each passing second. She tightened her grip on the handle of the old guitar case Dominique had lent her. It felt heavy in her hand, not just because of its weight, but because of what it represented. This was her first time stepping out of the shadows, her first time sharing her voice with the world. The thought alone was enough to send a shiver of fear down her spine. Taking a deep breath, Emily scanned the area for a suitable spot. The corner by the coffee shop seemed as good as any. Enough foot traffic to attract attention, but not so crowded that she'd be lost in the shuffle. She walked over, her steps tentative, and set the case down at her feet. As she pulled out the guitar, her fingers trembled, and for a moment she wondered if she could go through with it. But then she remembered Dominique's words, his unwavering belief in her. "You've got something special," he had said, Don't be afraid to share it. Those words had carried her this far, and she wasn't about to let fear take that away from her. Emily took another deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and began to strum. The first few chords were shaky, uncertain, but as she continued, she found her rhythm. The familiar movements of her fingers against the strings brought a sense of calm, grounding her in the present moment. Then she began to sing. At first, her voice was barely audible above the din of the street, but gradually it grew stronger. She sang a song her father used to play for her, a simple melody filled with longing and hope. The words flowed naturally, each one carrying a piece of her heart, a piece of the pain and the dreams she had kept hidden for so long. As her voice rose, it began to cut through the noise of the city. Passers-by slowed their steps, some turning to listen, others stopping altogether. There was something in her voice that drew them in, something raw and honest that resonated with the people around her. Emily kept her eyes closed, letting the music carry her. She sang as if she were alone, as if the bustling city had fallen away, leaving only her and the song. The more she sang, the more the fear melted away, replaced by a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. This was her voice, her story, and for the first time she was sharing it with the world. Among the crowd that had gathered, one man stood out. Julian Carter, a seasoned television producer, had been on his way to a meeting when the sound of Emily's voice stopped him in his tracks. There was something about the way she sang, something that made him forget the schedule he was supposed to keep, the calls he needed to make. He couldn't tear himself away. Julian had heard countless singers over the years, but there was something different about this girl. It wasn't just the quality of her voice, though it was undeniably beautiful. It was the emotion behind it, the way each note seemed to carry a weight of its own. Her voice was a blend of pain and hope, sorrow and strength, and it struck a chord deep within him. As Emily's song came to an end, Julian realized he had been holding his breath. The crowd around him burst into applause, and he joined in, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was no ordinary street performer. This was someone with real talent, someone who deserved to be heard on a much larger stage. As the applause died down and the crowd began to disperse, Julian approached Emily. She was packing up her guitar, her head still buzzing from the adrenaline of the performance. When she looked up and saw him, there was a moment of hesitation in her eyes. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice steady and professional, though there was a warmth in his tone. "I'm Julian Carter, a producer for America's Voices. I couldn't help but stop when I heard you singing. You have an incredible gift." Emily blinked, taken aback. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian handed her his card, his expression sincere. "I'd love for you to audition for the show. We're always looking for talent like yours. Think about it, and give me a call if you're interested." Emily took the card, her hands trembling slightly as she looked down at it. This wasn't something she had expected, not in her wildest dreams, but as she looked back up at Julian, she saw the same belief in his eyes that Dominique had shown her. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The studio was a maze of cables, cameras, and people moving with purposeful urgency. Emily stood just off stage, her heart pounding in her chest as she took in the scene. The lights were bright, casting long shadows across the floor, and the air buzzed with anticipation. This was the moment she had been preparing for, yet the reality of it was almost too overwhelming to bear. Samuel stood beside her, his presence a steadying force amidst the chaos. He had been with her every step of the way, from the streets of Manhattan to this very moment. His calm, reassuring gaze met hers, and he offered a small nod. "You've got this, Emily," he said, his voice low but firm. "Just remember why you're here." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded back, trying to steady her breathing. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared, Samuel." "That's normal," Samuel replied, his tone gentle. "But you've faced fear before and you've come out stronger. This is no different. Go out there and show them who you are." Emily took a deep breath, trying to absorb his words. The truth was, she had faced fear before, more times than she cared to count. But this felt different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about proving something to herself, about reclaiming the part of her that had been lost. The stage manager motioned to her, signaling that it was time. Emily felt her pulse quicken, but she squared her shoulders, determined to keep her composure. She glanced at Samuel one last time, drawing strength from his unwavering support, and then stepped out onto the stage. The lights were blinding, but Emily focused on the microphone in front of her, grounding herself in the familiar. She could hear the murmurs of the audience, the shuffling of papers from the judges' table, but she pushed it all to the back of her mind. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. She closed her eyes for a brief second, drawing in a deep breath, and then began to sing. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, as if testing the waters. But as the melody unfolded, her voice grew stronger, more assured. Each word carried the weight of her journey, the pain, the hope, the resilience that had brought her to this point. The studio seemed to fade away as she sang, the world narrowing down to just her and the music. Her voice filled the space, rich and full of emotion, each note resonating with the truth of her experience. She wasn't just singing, she was telling her story, laying bare her soul for all to see. When the final note hung in the air, there was a moment of profound silence. Emily stood still, her heart racing, unsure of what to expect. The lights were hot on her skin, and the quiet felt suffocating. Then, slowly, the sound of applause began to fill the studio. It started as a ripple, then grew into a wave, building in intensity until it was a full-fledged ovation. Emily opened her eyes, the brightness of the stage lights making her blink. The judges were standing, their faces a mixture of admiration and respect. The audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering, their energy almost tangible. She felt a rush of emotion, a mix of relief and disbelief. One of the judges, a woman with a sharp but kind face, leaned into her microphone. "Emily, that was extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying across the studio. "You have something truly special. We'd be honored to have you move on to the next round." Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She nodded, unable to find the words to express what she was feeling. It was more than just gratitude. It was a validation of everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, even when it seemed impossible. As she left the stage, Samuel was there, waiting for her, his eyes shining with pride. "I knew you could do it," he said, pulling her into a brief, tight hug. "I knew you had it in you." Emily smiled, the weight of her earlier fear lifting, replaced by a quiet confidence. "I did it, didn't I?" she said softly, almost as if needing to convince herself. "You did," Samuel confirmed, his voice full of warmth. "And this is just the beginning." As they walked out of the studio together, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future was still uncertain, but she had taken the first step, and that was enough. She had found her voice, and now nothing could take it away from her. The house on Upper East Side, once a symbol of Margaret's success, now felt like an empty shell. The high ceilings and polished floors only amplified the silence that hung heavy in the air. Margaret sat alone in the living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. It was late, but sleep had become an elusive comfort, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She reached for her glass of wine, her hand trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. The warmth of the liquid did little to ease the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to control every aspect of her life. But now, that strength felt like a brittle facade, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. Richard had been distant for weeks, his once attentive demeanor replaced by a cold indifference that Margaret had tried to ignore. But the signs were there, clear as day. The late nights at the office, the hurried phone calls he thought she didn't notice, the scent of perfume on his clothes that wasn't hers. She had convinced herself it was just a phase, that he would come around. But deep down, she had known the truth. The truth had come crashing down on her earlier that evening when she found the text messages on his phone. She hadn't meant to invade his privacy, but the nagging suspicion had grown too strong to ignore. And there it was, laid out in cold, stark words. A conversation with another woman, full of promises and plans that didn't include her. Margaret had confronted Richard, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Who is she?" she demanded, holding the phone up as if it were a weapon. "How long has this been going on?" Richard's response had been as cold and indifferent as his recent behavior. He didn't even bother to deny it. "It doesn't matter, Margaret," he said, his tone flat, emotionless. "What we had is over. You know that as well as I do." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She had expected anger, perhaps even guilt, but not this, not the complete lack of care in his voice, the way he dismissed her, their life together, as if it were nothing. "How can you say that?" Margaret's voice cracked as she struggled to keep her composure. "After everything we've been through?" Richard didn't meet her eyes. "It's just the way things are, Margaret. People change. We've changed. There's no point in dragging this out." With that, he had turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, stunned and speechless. She had watched him pack a bag, his movements deliberate, methodical, as if he had done this 1,000 times in his mind before. He didn't look back as he walked out the door, and Margaret was too numb to stop him. Now, hours later, the reality of it was sinking in. Richard was gone. He had left her just like that, without a second thought. And she was alone. Margaret set the glass down on the coffee table, her hands now too unsteady to hold it. She had built her life around this house, around Richard, around the image of perfection she had worked so hard to maintain. And now it was all gone. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark reminder of the emptiness that had taken root in her life. She reached for the remote, needing some distraction from the thoughts swirling in her mind. The television flickered to life, filling the room with the soft glow of the screen. Margaret flipped through the channels absent-mindedly until something caught her attention. It was a performance on a talent show, the camera focusing on a young woman standing on stage. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the voice, the face. It was Emily. Margaret sat up straighter, her eyes glued to the screen. Emily's voice filled the room, rich with emotion, each note carrying a depth of feeling that made Margaret's chest tighten. And then, as the song ended, Emily began to speak. "I've spent a long time feeling lost," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying sadness. "Feeling like I wasn't enough. like I didn't matter. But I've learned that we all have a voice, and that voice deserves to be heard, no matter who tries to silence it. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. There was no mistaking the message in Emily's words, the pain she had carried, the pain Margaret had inflicted. For the first time, Margaret saw the truth of what she had done, how her own ambitions and coldness had driven her daughter away. As the applause from the audience filled the room, Margaret sat frozen, the remote slipping from her grasp. The realization of what she had lost hit her like a tidal wave, drowning her in a sea of regret. She had pushed away the two people who had mattered most in her life, her husband and her daughter. And now, they were both gone. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as she reached for a pen and paper. She had to make this right, somehow. She had to try. With shaking hands she began to write, the words spilling onto the page like a confession, a plea for forgiveness. It was a small gesture, but it was all she had left. As she wrote, the house around her seemed to grow colder, the silence more oppressive. But Margaret kept writing, pouring her heart into the letter, hoping that it wasn't too late to reach the daughter she had once lost. The sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm, golden light across the small living room. Emily sat curled up on the worn couch, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The comforting scent of chamomile filled the air, blending with the faint aroma of the breakfast Samuel had made earlier. It was a quiet morning in Queens, the kind of morning that Emily had come to cherish in this new chapter of her life. The small house she shared with Samuel was nothing like the grand mansion she had once called home. But it was filled with warmth and care, qualities that had been sorely missing in her old life. Here she had found a sense of belonging, a place where she could simply be herself without fear of judgment or rejection. As she sipped her tea, there was a soft knock at the door. Emily glanced up, a slight frown crossing her face. They weren't expecting anyone. She set her cup down and stood, her steps light as she crossed the room. Opening the door, she found their mailman standing on the porch, a small stack of letters in his hand. He offered her a friendly smile as he handed them over. "Morning, Emily. Just a few things for you today." "Thanks, Tom," she replied, returning his smile. She closed the door behind her and returned to the couch, flipping through the mail absent-mindedly. Bills, a flyer for a local grocery store, a postcard from an old friend, and then, at the bottom of the pile, an envelope that made her heart skip a beat. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, elegant and precise, just like the woman who had written it, Margaret. Emily's fingers tightened around the envelope, her pulse quickening. It had been months since they had spoken, since that final confrontation that had driven her away. She hadn't expected to hear from her mother again, let alone receive a letter. For a long moment, Emily just stared at the envelope, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to toss it aside, to ignore whatever her mother had to say, but another part of her, the part that still carried the wounds of the past, needed to know. With a deep breath, she carefully tore the envelope open and pulled out the neatly folded letter inside. The words were few, but they carried the weight of years of silence and misunderstanding. "My dearest Emily, I have done many things in my life that I regret, but nothing more so than the way I treated you. I see now that I was wrong, that I hurt you in ways I can never fully atone for. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I am sorry. Truly and deeply sorry. I have always loved you, even if I never showed it in the way you deserved. If there is any chance that you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I would be eternally grateful. If not, I will understand. I only want you to be happy, to find the peace that I could never give you. With all my love, Mom." Emily read the letter twice, her emotions churning. Anger, pain, and betrayal swirled within her, but so did something else. something softer, more bittersweet, compassion, empathy. She could hear the sincerity in her mother's words, could feel the years of regret that had finally pushed Margaret to reach out. She set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. Memories flooded back, the good and the bad, the love that had once been there and the hurt that had followed. Her mother's coldness, her relentless drive, had shaped much of Emily's pain. But they had also shaped her resilience, her strength. Emily realized that holding on to her anger would only keep her chained to the past. Forgiveness wasn't about letting her mother off the hook. It was about freeing herself. It was about finding the peace she had fought so hard to achieve. She knew what she had to do. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Emily sat at the small kitchen table, a pen in her hand. She began to write, the words flowing from her heart, not just for her mother, but for herself. "Dear Mom, I've thought a lot about what you wrote, and I want you to know that I forgive you. I forgive you not because it erases the past, but because I need to move forward. I've built a new life here, and I'm happy. I hope you can find your own happiness too. Take care, Emily." As she sealed the envelope and placed it on the table, Emily felt a sense of calm wash over her. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer had the power to control her. She had found her voice, her strength, and now she had found her peace. The lights dimmed, casting the concert hall in a gentle twilight. The audience hushed, anticipation thick in the air as the first notes of the orchestra began to resonate. Emily stood just off stage, her heart beating in time with the music. The grandeur of the venue, a historic concert hall in the heart of New York, wasn't lost on her. This was the moment she had been working toward, a culmination of everything she had faced and overcome. She could feel the weight of Samuel's gaze from the wings, his steady presence, a constant source of comfort. He had been there through it all, his quiet support never wavering. Tonight, more than any other night, she wanted to make him proud. But beyond that, she wanted to honor the journey that had brought her here, to let the music speak for all the words she could never quite find. The cue came, and Emily took a deep breath, stepping out onto the stage. The spotlight found her, and for a brief moment, the magnitude of the moment nearly overwhelmed her. But then she remembered why she was here, why this mattered. This wasn't just about the music, it was about everything the music had come to represent. As she reached the center of the stage, the audience's applause washed over her like a wave. She acknowledged it with a small nod, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. The orchestra softened, and then, with the conductor's subtle gesture, they began the piece they had rehearsed so meticulously. Emily's voice filled the hall, rich and resonant. The first notes were low, carrying the weight of the past, the pain, the struggles that had shaped her. But as the song progressed, her voice climbed, gathering strength, transforming the sorrow into something powerful, something beautiful. The lyrics were simple, but they were hers, born from a place deep within her that only music could touch. She sang of love, not the kind that is perfect and unblemished, but the kind that survives the storms, that forgives and grows stronger. She sang of hope, of finding light in the darkest of places, and of the resilience that had carried her through. The audience was spellbound, their attention fixed on her as her voice soared through the final chorus. She could see their faces in the dim light, could feel the connection that her music had forged with each of them. This was more than just a performance, it was a shared experience, a moment where the walls between her and the world had come down, leaving only the raw, unfiltered emotion of the music. As the last note hung in the air, there was a beat of silence, a collective breath held by the audience. And then, like a dam breaking, The applause erupted, filling the hall with a thunderous sound. Emily stood still, letting the moment wash over her, a sense of fulfillment spreading through her. In the wings, Samuel's eyes were bright with pride. He clapped along with the crowd, his smile wide and genuine. He had always known this moment would come, but seeing it unfold before him was something else entirely. Emily had found her voice, and now the world had too. As the applause continued, Emily stepped back from the microphone, bowing slightly. Her heart swelled with a mixture of joy and relief. She had done it. She had taken everything she had been through, the pain, the loss, the uncertainty, and turned it into something beautiful, something meaningful. Returning to the wings, she was met with Samuel's embrace. "You were incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily looked up at him, her own eyes misty. "I finally understand," she replied softly. "Music isn't just a career for me. It's how I make sense of everything. It's how I heal." Samuel nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "And it's how you'll help others heal too. You've shown them that there's always hope, even when things seem impossible." As they walked out into the cool night air, the echoes of the performance still lingered in her mind. Emily felt lighter than she had in years, the burden of the past finally giving way to the promise of the future. She had found her purpose, her path forward, and it was clear and bright, lit by the music that had saved her. The small house in Brooklyn was modest, but it was home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. Emily stood by the kitchen counter, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She smiled to herself, a quiet contentment settling in her chest. This was a far cry from the grandeur she had once known, but it was everything she had ever needed. Samuel was in the garden, tending to the flowers they had planted together. He had a gentle touch with the plants, much like the way he had nurtured Emily through the darkest times of her life. She watched him through the window, his figure outlined by the soft morning light. There was something profoundly peaceful in this routine, in the way they had built a life together, brick by brick, moment by moment. Emily's music career had taken off in ways she hadn't imagined, but it was no longer the sole focus of her life. She had learned to balance the demands of her career with the simple joys of living, a lesson that had taken years to fully understand. The rush of the stage, the applause of the audience, it was all still thrilling, but now it was grounded by the quiet moments at home, by the life she had built with Samuel. "Morning," Samuel's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stepped into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, his face creased in a gentle smile. "Morning," Emily replied, handing him a cup of coffee. "The garden looks beautiful." "Thanks to you," he said, taking a sip. "I just make sure it doesn't get out of control." Emily chuckled, the sound light and free. It was still surprising sometimes how easy it was to laugh now, how the weight that had once pressed down on her had lifted. "I think we make a pretty good team," she said, leaning against the counter. Samuel nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "We do." There was a comfortable silence between them, one that spoke of years spent together, of battles fought and won. Samuel reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Emily's ear. "Are you thinking about your mother?" he asked, his voice soft. Emily nodded. "A little. It's strange, isn't it? How things change. I never thought we'd get to this point." "People can surprise you," Samuel said, his tone thoughtful. "And sometimes they surprise themselves." "She's trying," Emily admitted. "And I think I've finally forgiven her, for both of our sakes." Samuel squeezed her hand gently. That's all you can do. The rest will take time. Emily sighed, feeling a mix of relief and uncertainty. I just don't want to go back to that place. I've worked too hard to be where I am now. You won't, Samuel reassured her. You've built something strong here, something real, and you know how to protect it. She looked around the kitchen, at the photos on the wall, at the small but cozy living room beyond. It was a life they had crafted together, out of love, trust, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. I do, she agreed, her voice steady. And I won't let anything take that away. Samuel smiled, his eyes full of warmth. I believe you. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, the day stretching out before them like a blank canvas. Emily knew there would be challenges ahead, as there always were, but she also knew she wasn't facing them alone. She had Samuel, she had her music, and she had the peace that had eluded her for so long. As they stepped out into the garden together, the sun rising higher in the sky, Emily felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had been hard, unforgiving at times, but it had also been kind. It had given her a second chance, a new beginning, and she had embraced it with both hands. Happiness, she realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that she and Samuel were on together. And as long as they had each other, as long as they continued to nurture the life they had built, that happiness would continue to grow like the flowers in their garden, strong, resilient, and full of life. And that, my friends, is the heartbreaking yet powerful story of Emily. A tale that reminds us of the importance of love, family, and finding strength in the most unexpected places. Emily's journey is one that many of us can relate to in different ways, whether it's dealing with loss, seeking validation, or finding our voice in a world that often feels overwhelming. If this story touched you as much as it did me, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and of course, subscribe for more content like this. We dive into stories that not only entertain, but also make us think, reflect, and grow. Thank you for being a part of this journey with me. Until next time, keep believing in yourself, keep pushing forward, and remember, no matter how dark the night, there's always a flicker of light waiting to be found. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.